Russia is burning, not metaphorically or literally. Refineries in the heart of European Russia have gone dark this week. Fuel output across Samara, Saratov, and Ryazan is either suspended or sharply throttled. Long-range drones are punching through air defenses that were supposed to be impregnable. And while Moscow's propaganda apparatus tries to wave away the smoke, something quieter, something far more dangerous to Vladimir Putin, has happened on the ground in eastern Ukraine. In the last 24 hours, the Ukrainian armed forces did not just hold a line, they took back control. And what Russia lost in that single day, in men, in machines, in operational momentum, in strategic illusion, was devastating in a way the Kremlin cannot conceal and cannot replace. Let that sink in for a moment. According to the Ukrainian General Staff's most recent counts, Russia lost roughly 910 to 1,230 soldiers in 24-hour windows across this past week. The cumulative figure of Russian military casualties since February 2022 has now crossed 1.35 million. In April 2026, for the first time since August 2024, Russian forces suffered a net loss of territory controlled inside Ukraine, confirmed not by Kiev's press service, but by the Institute for the Study of War, working from satellite imagery and geolocated combat footage. This is not a story about a single village. This is a story about the collapse of the central Russian assumption that drove the entire 2026 spring campaign, the assumption that mass, brutality, and time would eventually crush a Ukrainian army that had been written off as exhausted. I have spent decades studying how armies move, how they break, and how they lie to themselves before they lose. What you are witnessing right now is not random chaos. It is the structural dismantling of a Russian theory of victory that was never as strong as Moscow believed and never as fragile as the West feared admitting. Pull the lens back. The real question is not whether Ukraine took back a few square kilometers near Dobrapilya or pushed Russian assault groups out of the northern approaches to Pokrovsk. The real question is why the largest army Europe has seen committed to a single offensive in 80 years is now visibly burning more men, more aircraft, and more fuel infrastructure per week than it can sustainably regenerate. And what happens next changes everything. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. To understand the magnitude of the last 24 hours, you have to rewind to where the Russian high command thought it would be by this point in 2026. The plan, briefed inside the Russian General Staff and signaled publicly through Kremlin allies, was straightforward. Push across 13 sectors of the front simultaneously, stretch Ukrainian reserves until they cracked, seize the remainder of Donetsk Oblast, Pokrovsk, Mirnohrad, Kostiantynivka, then Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Use that strategic belt as leverage in any negotiation, and use the threat of a long war to break Western political will. On paper in February, that plan looked overwhelming. Russia had concentrated more than 170,000 soldiers in the Pokrovsk operational direction alone. More than 100,000 had been positioned in the immediate envelopment ring around the city itself. Glide bombs were being produced at industrial pace. North Korean munitions were flowing west. Iranian-designed Shahed variants were rolling off 2 parallel production lines in Tatarstan. On the actual battlefield, that assumption failed. This is the first doctrinal point I need you to internalize because mainstream coverage keeps missing it. Russia's spring offensive was not designed to be efficient. It was designed to be inexorable. Moscow wagered that if it could trade soldiers for meters faster than Ukraine could replace lines and resources, attrition arithmetic would do the political work. By the first third of 2026, that arithmetic broke. Independent analyses, including the Royal United Services Institute and ISW's geospatial assessments, found that Russian forces seized an average of 2.9 square kilometers per day in early 2026, down from 9.76 square kilometers per day during the same window in 2024. The cost of those 2.9 kilometers was catastrophic, an average of more than 1,000 Russian casualties per day, sometimes more. Russia was spending the budget of a major war and getting the territorial output of a border skirmish. This is the hidden military variable that almost no one outside professional staff colleges is talking about clearly. Attrition is not a strategy unless your opponent is attriting faster than you are. By April 2026, that condition reversed. Russia lost approximately 116 square kilometers of net territory inside Ukraine in a single month. And in early May, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky confirm that across the recent counteroffensive operations in Dobropilya, in the northern Pokrovsk envelopment, in segments of Kharkiv Oblast, Ukrainian forces had retaken approximately 480 square kilometers of ground. That figure now exceeds even the famous Dobropilya counteroffensive of 2025 that first cracked the Russian myth of unstoppable forward pressure. And it gets even more serious from here, because this is not a story about geography. It is a story about doctrine. The territory Ukraine is taking back is the same terrain Russia spent the entire winter and spring trying to convert into political leverage. Every village retaken near Dobropilya is not just a tactical reversal. It is a public falsification of the Russian theory that time was on Moscow's side. When you watch the Russian state press try to reframe these losses as regrouping or as part of a phased operation, what you are watching is not strategy. You are watching narrative damage control from an army that no longer controls the operational tempo. The side that controls tempo controls meaning. Russia has lost both. Now let me show you how the last 24 hours fits inside this larger collapse, because the events of this single day are not isolated. They are the convergence of three campaigns Russia has been quietly losing for months. The first is the territorial campaign on the ground. Across this week, Ukrainian forces continued counterattacks inside the Pokrovsk urban perimeter, where small Ukrainian elements have maintained a foothold that ISW has documented in its May 11th assessment. The Ukrainian 7th Rapid Reaction Corps, the Azov Corps, and elements of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade have continued pressing in the Dobropilya tactical area, where multiple villages have been retaken in successive operations. North of Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces liberated villages, including the corridor pushing toward Novoekonomikna and Razin, that Russian command had marked as consolidated weeks earlier. These were not symbolic recaptures. These villages sit astride Russian ground lines of communication that feed the entire Pokrovsk encirclement attempt. When you pull a Russian battalion out of a village to keep your supply road open, you are no longer offensive. You are reactive. That is the doctrinal status Russia now occupies. The second campaign is in the sky. Over the past several weeks, Russia has lost an unusually clustered series of high-value aircraft. Su-34 fighter bomber, the central platform of the Russian glide bomb campaign that has terrorized Ukrainian frontline cities for 2 years, went down, and in 26 military transport carrying 29 personnel was lost. An AN-72P maritime patrol aircraft was destroyed. A Su-30 multi-role fighter was lost in occupied Crimea, and subsequent reporting confirms an additional Su-34 has since been removed from Russia's operational order of battle. 4 irreplaceable airframes in 4 days, followed by more. These are not training accidents. These are the aircraft that anchor Russia's ability to deliver standoff bombing campaigns against Ukrainian cities and frontline positions. The Su-34 fleet in particular is the workhorse of the glide bomb war. Every airframe lost is one more glide bomb sortie that does not happen tomorrow. The third campaign, and this is the one Moscow truly cannot recover from in the short term, is on the industrial backbone of Russian state power. Pull the lens back here, because this is where the verdict gets delivered. This week, Ukrainian long-range drones forced central Russian oil refineries to either halt operations or sharply cut output. Reuters confirmed it from refinery sources. The Moscow Times confirmed it from inside Russia. Reporting from Euronews documented strikes on a refinery in the Saratov region, and the Syzran complex in Samara Oblast was hit again, with casualties on the ground. Ukrainian planners have now doubled the number of Russian refineries targeted since the start of this year, according to Reuters' energy desk. Fuel shortages have already appeared in occupied Crimea and across multiple Russian federal districts. Civilian queues have formed at gas stations in regions that, on the Kremlin's map, are supposed to be hundreds of kilometers from any battlefield. This matters enormously, and I need you to understand exactly why, because mainstream framing keeps treating these refinery strikes as a side story. They are not a side story. They are the main story. Here's the doctrinal reality. Modern mechanized warfare runs on fuel. Russian tactical aviation runs on fuel. Russian armored columns run on fuel. Russian logistics, every truck, every fuel bowser, every diesel generator in every dugout from Bakhmut to Kherson runs on processed product, not crude. Russia has vast crude reserves. What Russia has a limited quantity of is functioning refining capacity, and that capacity is concentrated in a small number of large industrial complexes. When Ukrainian drones knock those out, even temporarily, the effect is not measured in dollars. It is measured in operational tempo at the front. A Russian tank brigade that cannot fuel its vehicles, cannot launch the offensive Moscow has been screaming about for 6 months. A Russian fighter regiment that cannot fully fuel its Su-34s, cannot drop the glide bombs that have been Russia's only consistent battlefield advantage. This is the moment where battlefield and economy fuse into a single weapon, and Ukraine is the one wielding it. Let me layer in the numerical specifics, because the numbers tell you exactly how serious this has become. According to Ukraine's general staff, Russian personnel losses in single 24-hour periods over the past week have ranged from 910 to 1,230 soldiers killed or wounded. Russian total casualties since the start of the war have now crossed 1.35 million by Ukrainian count, with independent Western estimates placing killed in action figures alone in the range of 250,000 to 325,000 by the end of 2025. Russian armored vehicle losses, drone losses, and artillery system destructions continue at rates that the Russian defense industry, even on a full war footing, cannot replace one for one. Ukrainian drone operators are now reportedly responsible for as much as 96% of Russian frontline casualties in some sectors of the front, according to Ukrainian operational data released in April. Artillery and small arms are no longer the dominant killers in this war. Cheap, scalable, software-defined drones are. That is a doctrinal revolution, not a tactical adjustment. And it gets even more serious from here, because the Russian command structure is now under a kind of pressure it has not faced since the catastrophic withdrawal from Kharkiv in autumn 2022. Pull the lens back. In a war of attrition, the side that is losing first is not the side with fewer reserves. It is the side that loses the political ability to spend those reserves. Russia spent the winter and spring of 2026 telling its own population that Pokrovsk would fall by spring, that Donetsk Oblast would be liberated by summer, that Ukrainian resistance would collapse under sustained pressure. None of that has happened. Instead, Ukrainian counterattacks have retaken territory. Ukrainian drones have set fire to oil infrastructure in regions Russians were told were untouchable. Ukrainian special forces have continued long-range strikes against air bases hosting strategic bombers. And Russian airmen are dying in airframes that Russia cannot replace inside this decade. Now, mainstream news framing of this week's events misses 3 things, and I want you to lock these into your understanding, because they will define how you read every subsequent update. The first thing mainstream coverage misses is that Ukrainian recapture of territory is no longer cosmetic. It is structural. When Ukrainian forces retake villages along Russian ground lines of communication around Pokrovsk, they are not just shifting pins on a map. They are forcing Russian commanders to reroute supply, redeploy units from offensive to defensive postures, and absorb the operational friction that comes with collapsing forward momentum. That is the same dynamic that broke Russian lines in Kharkiv in 2022. We are watching the early seismograph readings of the same earthquake, slower, smaller, but unmistakably the same kind. The second thing mainstream coverage misses is the asymmetry of replacement. Ukraine loses a drone, Ukraine builds 3 more by next week. Ukraine loses a brigade commander, Ukraine has a cadre of officers who have been trained on the most lethal battlefield of the 21st century. Russia loses a Su-34, and that aircraft does not return, not next month, not next year, possibly not this decade. Russia's airframe production has been crippled by Western sanctions on avionics, microelectronics, and specialty materials. Russia's officer corps has been ground down by 3 years of meat grinder attrition. The Russian replacement curve flattens further each month. The Ukrainian replacement curve, in critical categories like drones and electronic warfare, steepens. This is what asymmetric adaptation actually looks like. It is not glamorous. It is not televised. It is decisive. The third thing mainstream coverage misses is that this is now an economic war Russia is losing inside its own borders. Russian regional governors are now publicly acknowledging fuel shortages. The ruble has weakened. Russian federal budgeting for 2026 was built on oil and refined product revenue assumptions that the drone campaign is steadily falsifying. Each refinery struck is not just a tactical asset destroyed. It is a hole in the Russian state budget, and the Russian state budget is the only thing that has held this war together since the foreign exchange reserves were frozen in 2022. History will record that this was the period in which the Russian theory of victory broke in public view. Not in a single battle, not in a single retreat. In a slow, compounding accumulation of asymmetries, drone versus airframe, refinery strike versus mechanized brigade, Ukrainian operational creativity versus Russian doctrinal rigidity. The Kremlin built its entire strategy on the assumption that Western patience would crack before Russian capacity did. The opposite is happening. Russian capacity is cracking visibly, while Western support, despite political turbulence, continues to flow in critical categories like air defense, long-range strike, and intelligence sharing. Now we come to the climactic operation, the one that should be studied at every staff college for the next 20 years. Ukrainian planners did something this season that almost no military analyst predicted in 2024. They abandoned the doctrine of seeking decisive ground breakthrough. They replaced it with a doctrine of distributed, simultaneous, multi-domain pressure. Instead of concentrating force at one point of the front to punch through Russian lines, which is what Western advisors had pushed for in 2023 with catastrophic results, Ukrainian command spread the pressure across the entire theater. Counterattacks in Dobropilya, counterattacks in Kupiansk, where Ukrainian forces stabilized control of the town through a series of sustained operations from December 2025 onward, holding actions in Pokrovsk's urban perimeter. Drone strikes on Saratov, Samara, Ryazan, occupied Crimea, and the strategic bomber bases at Engels and Olenya. Special operations raids inside Russian territory. Each individual action is survivable for Russia. The combination is not. This is the doctrine you need to understand. When an adversary lacks the technological depth to defend everywhere at once, you do not pick one place to hit them hardest. You hit them everywhere at the speed they cannot match. That is precisely what Ukrainian command is doing. It is the doctrinal mirror of what the Kremlin tried to do with 13-sector pressure, except Ukraine is succeeding at it because Ukrainian platforms are cheaper, more numerous, software-defined, and operationally flexible in ways the Russian military has not been able to adapt to. What you are witnessing is the first true war of asymmetric industrial adaptation in the 21st century, and the side that adapts faster is winning. Now, let me give you the strategic forecast because every honest analyst owes you not just the autopsy of what happened, but a clear projection of what comes next. In the immediate term, expect Russian command to attempt a propaganda counterstrike. There will likely be a high-visibility attack on a Ukrainian city designed to dominate news cycles and obscure the operational reality on the ground. Watch for it. When you see it, recognize it for what it is, a confession, not a triumph. Armies that are winning at the front do not need to strike apartment blocks in the rear. They strike apartment blocks when the front is no longer producing the headlines they need. In the medium term, expect the refinery campaign to deepen. Ukrainian long-range strike capacity continues to grow. The number of refineries targeted has already doubled this year. Expect that number to keep climbing. The cumulative effect on Russian fuel logistics, civilian morale, and federal budget will become impossible to hide by late summer. This is the lever Kyiv has chosen, and the evidence suggests Kyiv intends to pull it harder. In the longer term, and this is the verdict I want you to walk away with, Russia will be forced into a choice it has spent 4 years trying to avoid. Either negotiate from a visibly weakening position, accepting terms it would have rejected in 2023, or continue a war whose operational logic now favors the defender and the adapter. Both paths lead to a strategic outcome the Kremlin did not plan for. The path of structural Russian decline is now embedded in the data, not in the rhetoric. The Ukrainian armed forces did not just take back control of villages and supply lines in the last 24 hours. They took back control of the narrative arc of this war. They took back the right to define what the next 6 months mean. They took back the strategic initiative that Moscow believed was permanently theirs after the failed 2023 counteroffensive. And what Russia lost in that 24-hour window, in soldiers killed, in aircraft removed from the order of battle, in refineries forced offline, in territory ceded, in the public credibility of the spring offensive itself, was not a single day's setback. It was a sample of the trajectory. This is the lesson I need you to keep with you long after this analysis ends. Wars are not lost in the moment of surrender. They are lost in the moment when one side's theory of victory stops matching the data on the ground, and the other side has the discipline to keep pressing without declaring victory prematurely. Ukraine has that discipline. Russia is past that inflection point. Everything from here is consequence. If this kind of strategic analysis is what you came here for, the kind of clear-eyed military assessment that does not flinch from data and does not waste your time with both sides hedging, then I need your help. We are pushing toward a subscriber goal that lets this channel continue delivering this level of daily strategic analysis without relying on sensational shortcuts. If you have not yet subscribed, take a moment now and do it. Your subscription is the single most important signal you can send that this work matters and that you want it to continue. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay with this channel, because the developments coming in the next weeks will determine the strategic shape of Europe for the next decade, and you are going to want to be ahead of the headlines, not behind them. The question that remains is not whether Ukraine can hold what it has retaken. The Ukrainian armed forces have already answered that question on the ground. The question is how long the Russian command can continue to deny to itself and to the Russian public that the entire foundation of the 2026 campaign has collapsed beneath them. And that question does not have a simple answer. But every refinery still burning tonight, every Russian column still rerouting around a village it expected to control by April, every Su-34 pilot ejecting over the front, every soldier in a Russian assault group who did not come home in the last 24 hours, every one of those is part of the answer being written in real time in front of all of us. Stay with this channel, because what happens next changes everything,